The chamber is thick with tension, the kind you can almost taste in the air. Cameras hum, spotlights glare, and every viewer waiting at home knows they are about to witness something volatile. At the center of it all, Stephen Miller leans forward, sharp elbows digging into the desk as his voice slices across the room. His words are not questions, not ideas, but interruptions. Once the sound of his interjection cuts like glass. Twice, louder, sharper, meant to overpower rather than converse. 3 times. The rhythm of arrogance grows predictable, the disdain practically dripping. 4 times. The audience shifts uncomfortably because this isn't debate, it's domination. 5 times. Crockett tries to continue, but his voice barrels through, an iron gate slamming down on every syllable. 6 times. The room buzzes with disbelief, murmurs rippling like heat through dry air. Each interruption stacks atop the last, like blows from a hammer not meant to engage but to silence. Television shots cut from Miller's tightened jaw to Crockett's steady eyes, her lips pressed. Her shoulders squared, the figure of patience forced to endure. The imbalance is obvious. The villain thrives on chaos, while the hero gathers strength from restraint. Every viewer knows the frustration of being spoken over, the sting of hearing your voice erased. Miller's performance is more than political. They see the power play that too many have endured in classrooms, boardrooms, even living rooms. It's a familiar insult, disguised as debate. And yet beneath the noise, something begins to simmer. Crockett isn't rattled. She isn't shrinking. With each attempted silencing, she's measuring him, cataloging his impatience and preparing her own storm. The suspense builds in every pause that isn't hers. Audiences are gripping armrests and leaning closer to their screens because they know something is coming. One voice is running on fumes. The other is storing lightning. The interruptions tally. 6. 6 chances for Miller to flex his dominance. 6 chances for the room to tilt toward arrogance. And then, silence. Just long enough to tremble with expectation. Because the 7th attempt will not be like the others, will not end the way Miller imagines. And just when it seemed like Miller had seized the moment, one sentence would turn the tide of the entire exchange. Why does this exchange matter? On the surface, it could be brushed aside as just another clash inside Washington's unforgiving halls. A loud man interrupts, a determined woman persists. It could blend in too. The endless scroll of political theater. But this moment is different. The stakes run far deeper than a shouting match. Because here, in the tension between Stephen Miller's interruptions and Jasmine Crockett's composure, something fundamental about American democracy is being tested. The right to dignity in the face of dismissal. And the right to be heard when someone would rather silence you, every word. Every sharp interjection from Miller represents not only a challenge to Crockett, but a broader attempt to reinforce a culture that thrives on arrogance. His brand of politics, the sneering interruptions, the contemptuous dominance, goes an old order, one designed to remind the marginalized and the rising voices, you belong in the corner. Stay small, stay unheard. To an audience watching, online or on television, those 6 interruptions resonate as something personal. They've lived it, being spoken over in meetings, being ignored not for a lack of ideas, but because their identity didn't fit the room. Miller in this story looms as more than just an antagonist. He is the embodiment of every arrogant figure who ever hijacked a conversation to deny someone else their humanity, and opposite him stands Crockett. Not as a mere participant in a policy debate, but as a symbol of the generational shift America finds itself in. She is the steady counterforce to an establishment voice that longs to drown out change. With her poise under fire, she speaks for a new majority, one unafraid, unapologetic, unwilling to retreat into silence when power shouts in their faces. It's not only her seat at the table that matters, it's what her presence represents. Immigrants who fought for citizenship. Women who demanded entry into the conversation. Communities who were long treated as invisible until they forced the world to look. The stakes, then, are not only parliamentary, they are spiritual, cultural, generational. If Miller's interruptions succeed of arrogance indeed, drowns out resilience, the message would echo far beyond that chamber, that those with the loudest voice and deepest privilege still control the narrative. But if Crockett's response cuts through, if dignity pierces arrogance, then a new lesson is written, one that will be remembered and retold. The audience doesn't simply want Crockett to reply. They need her too. They need validation that arrogance cannot forever shout down dignity. And note the emotional charge. This drama ignites. The frustration isn't singular, it's collective. Viewers whisper at screens, mouths tightening as they count the interruptions. With her, 6 times already, a mother mutters at her kitchen table, remembering meetings where her voice was stolen. He won't let her speak, a college student sighs, calling classroom arguments where their identity was ridiculed. Millions find themselves woven into the drama because, in Crockett's resistance, they see their own underdog struggle, amplified to a national stage. This is why the audience cannot leave. This is why their hands hover over the volume control, hearts skipping with frustration, waiting for the turn. The stakes are not just about one political theater, they are about whether democracy's promise of fair voice can withstand an orchestrated attempt to bury it under noise. Miller's arrogance threatens to write silence back into stone. Crockett's resilience fights to etch dignity into the script of American progress. But to truly grasp the weight of this moment, we must see who these two combatants really are. 2. Understand why those 6 interruptions carried such venom. We must look closely at the figure wielding them. Stephen Miller is not someone who stumbled into arrogance by accident. His story, his rise to prominence, has always been framed around one defining trait: an unflinching belief in his own authority. From a young strategist who thrived on shock commentary to one of the most influential advisors in the highest corridors of power, Miller has consciously built his legacy on being loud, polarizing, and unapologetically hostile. His public persona became defined not by lifting others up, but by pushing them down. In speech after speech, Miller sharpened his rhetoric like a blade, targeting immigrant communities, ridiculing progressive voices, styling himself as the intellectual soldier in a war against multicultural America. He did not merely make arguments, he sneered them, delivered words not as conversation, but as verdicts. He chose dismissiveness as a trademark and hostility as a strategy. To many, he came to symbolize the politics of exclusion, a voice that thrilled at closing doors rather than opening them. Consider the controversies that trailed him. At every turn, sweeping policies written with the ink of fear, directives aimed at controlling borders with the blunt edge of cruelty, speeches that elevated nationalism while diminishing collective humanity. These were not hiccups of miscalculation. They were precise, chosen tactics. Miller's sharp tone and icy confidence carried one message: he genuinely believed that domination was the only path to credibility. For him, interruption was not rudeness, it was victory. To speak over someone was not a loss of decorum. It was a strategy to remind them of their supposed smallness. And yet, beneath the sheen of control, the contradictions loom large. Miller styled himself as a guardian of law and order, yet his tactics often undermined the very democratic principles of fair voice and open dialogue. He championed the Constitution when it suited his argument, only to trample on its spirit. When voices he disliked tried to claim their rights beneath its banner, he cloaked arrogance in the language of patriotism. But the camouflage was thin. Speeches about protecting America frequently fell flat because they betrayed an undercurrent of fear, not pride. He radiated certainty even as the world around him grew weary of division. Those who've listened to Miller describe the chill of his delivery, the calm on the surface, sharp in execution. Tay never loses his rhythm because he doesn't intend to engage, he intends to bulldoze. In debates, silence is his enemy. If another voice grows, he must cut it down. Every phrase he utters carries a pointed edge, yet it is precisely this addiction to the tactic of interruption that reveals his greatest blind spot. When power becomes habit, arrogance dulls awareness. He fails to see that relentless interruption does not just silence it, also reveals. It exposes insecurity, fear of opposition, and a lack of resilience when confronted with calmly wielded truth. The hypocrisy of his method is striking. He overwhelms others under the banner of strength. Yet interruption is its own admission of weakness. the equivalent of plugging ears and shouting to drown out what one cannot refute. Viewers, even those with differing political affiliations, sense the imbalance. They may not always agree with the opposing voice, but they recognize the cowardice hidden in Miller's insistence to dominate. In those 6 interruptions, people did not see conviction. They saw desperation disguised as authority. And consider his broader legacy. His policies were designed to project permanence, to build an America frozen in time, unyielding to change. But history is never static, and communities he tried to diminish have only grown stronger. Arrogance convinced him he could command the tide. Reality would prove otherwise. His tactics, his interruptions, and his disdain may have won him fleeting dominance in moments like this debate. But ego blinds him to the truth. Every empire builder eventually faces control, built on silencing others. It eventually collapses under its own weight. The audience senses this as Miller cuts off Crockett again and again. They know this isn't just about 2 people at a table. It's about clashing worldviews. It represents the establishment arrogance of yesterday, thriving on intimidation. She represents the persistence of today's new voices, unwilling to bow when someone raises their volume. The suspense builds because everyone has seen his type before, and everyone wonders when, if ever, such brazenness will finally meet its match. Long before her measured stare cut across the debate chamber, Jasmine Crockett was earning her voice the hard way. Raised in communities where opportunities were never simply handed out, she understood from an early age what it meant to fight for recognition. Pain and perseverance shaped her path, from classes where she was underestimated to courtrooms where she defended those no one else would touch, to the campaigns that propelled her into the halls of national power. Her story isn't one of privilege, but of persistence, built brick by brick on dignity and sheer determination. As a lawyer, Crockett cut her teeth defending those who stood on fragile ground. Her clients weren't the wealthy or shielded. Were ordinary citizens who had been ignored, trampled, or shoved to the margins. In those trial halls, she learned the art of composure under pressure. Opposing attorneys might sneer, dismiss, or attempt to steamroll her narrative. But Crockett never yielded. She understood that rushing to anger gave away power, that dignity in the face of belittlement could weigh more than a dozen arguments. Each case became another rehearsal for the battles she would later face in the political arena. Her work was never simply about professional achievement. For Crockett, it was personal. She carried the stories of her community, the single mothers hustling to jobs, the immigrant families scraping to make a life, the young students punished not because they lacked potential, but because no one took the time to believe in them. She knew the sting of being dismissed, not on the merit of an idea, but on an assumption tied to race, gender, or background. Each scar, each memory of being spoken over, hardened into courage. She decided that public service would not just be her career, but her mission. When she stepped into politics, she did so not with bombast, but with conviction. Crockett's rise was never about volume, it was about values. She campaigned as the underdog, fighting uphill battles, shaking hands in neighborhoods too often excluded from decision-making, listening to people whose stories had been drowned out by elites who treated their pain as distraction. She ran not to bask in a spotlight, but to shine it where others preferred shadows. So when constituents spoke of her, they didn't speak of flashy promises or empty rhetoric. They spoke of a woman who showed up, listened, and carried their voices to places they rarely reached. In those moments, her character revealed itself. Most strongly, a balance of humility and fire. Yes, she could be forceful when injustice demanded it. But she also brought nuance, patience, and empathic qualities often missing in political brawls. More than once, observers noted her ability to hold the line during hearings where tempers flared. While others spiraled into shouting matches, Crockett's strength was in endurance, her refusal to be rattled. Viewers felt the steadiness. She didn't need to roar to stand firm. It is this resilience that made her more than a politician. It made her a symbol for young people, especially young women of color, who had been told to keep quiet, who had been chastised when they raised their hands too often in classrooms. Crockett became vindication. She represented the reality that a person can be interrupted, doubted, dismissed countless times, and still refused to disappear. Her composure didn't erase frustration. It transcended it, narrating a message louder than any shout. Your voice is needed, and it will not be erased. But there is more. Crockett entered a political culture still heavily tilted toward the arrogance of the old guard. Men like Miller had built careers on talking over anyone who challenged their worldview. They acted as if every debate was rightfully theirs to conduct, every microphone theirs to dominate. Yet Crockett's presence contested that assumption simply by existing in that chamber. Her posture, her voice, her calm delivery, they carried with them the weight of change. A generational current that Miller never anticipated. Yes, Crockett understood the cruelty of politics. She knew voices like hers were constantly questioned, dissected, mocked in the media, twisted on social platforms. But what her opponents failed to grasp is that she had grown used to this terrain. Her composure wasn't passive. It was crafted from decades of practice. Each interruption she once endured became training for the interruption she would later receive from Miller. Each attempt to silence her became fuel for her steady persistence, so when audiences saw her in that chamber, they weren't merely observing a representative, they were witnessing the culmination of a life shaped in fire. Tested under the strain of injustice, renewed by the strength of community. That is why her eyes did not flinch when Miller's voice lacerated the air with dismissal after dismissal. Where others might buckle, Crockett stood taller. Where others might snap back impulsively, she waited. She had the patience of someone who understood that dignity was itself a weapon, a blade sharper than arrogance ever expected. And this is her defining superpower: composure under pressure. Not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. When others accelerate the chaos, she slows it. When opponents amplify noise, she amplifies clarity. It is this very discipline, the art of waiting for the strike and then letting truth fall. Like thunder that has made her so dangerous to men like Miller, her supporters see it. Her community feels it. The millions watching will recognize it in that chamber. The intimidation Miller wielded was precisely the type Crockett had been forged to resist. If arrogance was his habit, composure was her destiny. And as each interruption piled high as the frustration settled into the bones of the audience, they found themselves rooting for her not just because they wanted her to respond, but because they needed her to. They needed her to embody their own silenced voices, to prove that dignity could still shatter contempt. And so when Miller's storm of interruptions began, Crockett was uniquely armed to answer. The first interruption arrived almost casually, as if Stephen Miller couldn't help himself. Jasmine Crockett had barely begun her sentence when his voice started in, clipped, dismissive, a sharp cough of arrogance disguised as rebuttal. She paused only briefly, allowed the noise to pass, then continued. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed minor, just a bump on the conversation's road. But those who knew Miller recognized it as the opening salvo of a strategy he had honed for years. Speak early, speak over, dominate the rhythm before your opponent can even plant their footing. The second interruption rang louder, it's more forceful. Cutting through Crockett's words like an air raid siren, meant not to persuade but to unsettle. His tone carried a challenge, a reflexive dismissal not just of her argument, but of her right to the microphone itself. The camera panned to Crockett. She did not flinch, did not raise her voice in retaliation. Instead, she widened the moment of silence, letting his interruption echo uncomfortably, laying bare the disrespect of it. In that pause, the audience could feel her strength, composure as quiet defiance. Then came the third. By now, the pattern was taking shape. Miller leaned in physically, gesturing with sharp motions as if to imply he was the authority and she the accessory. His voice dripped with the belief that repetition equals dominance. But Crockett, steady as stone, refused to be rushed. Let him barrel on, his interruption rolling through the chamber. And when she resumed, her tone was unchanged, her eyes locked not on him but on the audience. She was speaking to the people, not her heckler. The fourth interruption grew angrier, this time tinged with frustration at her refusal to match his hostility. He attempted to shove his viewpoint into every syllable, an overlapping storm of noise determined to drown her out. It backfired. Spectators shifted in their seats, a murmur spreading. The arrogance was beginning to read not as strength, but as desperation. Crockett's calm amplified the imbalance, one figure flailing for authority, the other absorbing the storm with near-surgical patience. His interruptions, once framed as power moves, were unraveling into spectacle. By the fifth, the weight of the theatrics had settled into the air. Miller's voice cracked slightly with intensity, his timing off. He sensed the room tilting, but pressed harder, confusing volume with control. Crockett's silence between his bursts pulled viewers deeper into the drama. Every pause she allowed him was a rope he thought was climbing, unaware he was tightening it around himself. The longer she endured, the more embarrassing his circus became. Inside homes across America, countless viewers shook their heads, some muttering, some laughing, many enraged. The shared recognition was clear. This was no longer debate. This was a man unraveling in real time. And then, the sixth, the crescendo of interruption. Miller's voice now thundered, nearly breathless with urgency, pressing over Crockett without even a fig leaf of civility. The chamber buzzed with unease. Staffers exchanged glances. Journalists scribbled furiously. This wasn't simply disrespected. It was deliberate sabotage. For a brief moment, Crockett leaned back, letting the chaos surge past her like a wave breaking against rock. Audiences could feel the tension coiling beneath her calm. Her restraint had become electric, its own form of resistance. The more he clawed for control, the more it slipped from his grasp. By the sixth interruption, the imbalance was unbearable. Viewers held their breath, frustrated, hands balling into fists. The arrogance was suffocating. 6 times, louder each. Attempt, and still Crockett refused to be broken. The villain, who believed domination was strength, was exposing himself as a caricature. The hero, who refused to lash out prematurely, was preparing the strike. Every interruption was supposed to weaken her. Instead, it sharpened her. Every outburst was intended to silence her. Instead, it amplified the anticipation of her reply. Audiences could feel the turn coming. 1,000 conversations, 1,000 memories of being cut off and dismissed. Every one of them crystallized in this showdown. Miller had overplayed his hand. His arrogance was now his cage. But the 7th exchange no one in that room would ever forget. The chamber had grown restless. 6 interruptions had rung out like sirens. Of contempt, each one louder, more jagged, more desperate. By the 6th, Miller was breathless with his own performance. Spittle gathering at the edge of sharp words, body pitched forward as if sheer force of volume could crown him the winner. But in the eye of his storm sat Jasmine Crockett, calm, unshaken, silent. She leaned back just slightly, letting the dust of his 6th tirade hang like smoke in the air. And then, quiet, the silence stunned. Where his voice had been relentless noise, now the void was deafening. Crockett's stillness forced the room to breathe again, a stray heartbeat beneath the fury. The cameras froze on her face, steady eyes, composure. Carved from steel, she did not rush into the next word, did not fight to squeeze through the cracks of his interruption. She let the silence stretch. It grew longer and longer still. The audience squirmed, convinced they'd reached the moment of collapse. But in reality, it was the moment of crafting. Crockett's pause was the tightening of a bowstring. Oblivious, still believed he wielded the arrow, then softly but firmly. Her voice broke the silence. That's 6 times you've spoken over me, 6 times you've tried to drown out my words. But it only takes once, just once, for the truth to land. And here it is. The room leaned closer. The line unfolded with controlled precision, hammered clean out of dignity. And then came the blow. Every time you cut me off, you don't reveal my weakness, you reveal yours. Because a man confident in his conviction doesn't need to silence a woman to be heard. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No pen scribbling, no cough from the back row, no background murmuring. Just silence. Dead, resonant silence. The air itself seemed to halt so the words could echo cleanly through it. Her delivery wasn't thunderous. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The strength of her line wasn't volume. It was clarity. Truth doesn't shout. It lands, and land it did with the weight of a hammer, with the sting of lightning grounding itself to earth. It landed so cleanly that the only movement left in the room was Miller's falter, his jaw dropping just slightly, his eyes narrowing, in a delayed attempt to swing back, but everyone saw it. The flicker of panic, the crack in the armor. He was rattled. His interruptions had been choreographed swagger. Now, stripped bare, they looked like the tantrums of a schoolyard bully. Crockett continued, voice stronger now, no interruption daring to cut her. You can interrupt me a dozen times more if you like, Stephen. But understand this, every time you do, the whole country sees it. They see you trying to shout down not just my voice, but the voices of women, immigrants, working people, anyone who has ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. And they will remember who tried to silence them and who refused to be silenced. That was it, the dagger? It's a pivot that transformed his arrogance into his defeat. Every viewer at home felt the electricity surge down their spine. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was vindication, validation. The impossible fantasy of delivering that perfect line after years of being interrupted, bulldozed, made invisible. Crockett had taken all 6 interruptions and welded them into ammunition, firing it with perfect aim in a single devastating moment. The reaction was instantaneous. Journalists froze, mid-note, eyebrows arched high. Staffers clamped hands around their mouths to suppress gasps. And in every living room across America, the audience erupted. Some laughed out loud, relief surging into joy. Others clapped it there. Screens, as if their applause could travel through the broadcast to reach her. A young college student whispered, yes. That's it, as if Crockett had spoken directly for her. A grandmother, sitting in silence beside her children, nodded with tears prickling at the corner of her eyes, remembering every meeting and every table where she had been talked over. In that moment, millions recognized themselves in Crockett's composure and in her strike. Miller tried to recover, fumbling for a retort, leaning forward with defensive gestures. But his voice caught. What could he possibly say? He had spent 6 rounds proving her point for her. Every outburst had been Exhibit A to her closing argument. And so his attempt to rise came out shallow, fragmented, ineffective. It wasn't authority anymore. It was noise around the edges, static trapped inside a wind tunnel. Crockett sat straighter. Her silence returned. Not the silence of defeat this time, but the silence of ownership. She didn't need another line. The devastation was complete. The cameras caught the contrast perfectly. On one side, a furious man strangled by his own tactics. On the other, a calm woman who had reclaimed the room with dignity, and here lies the artistry of her mic drop. She never raised her tone above civility. She did not interrupt back. She did not match fire with fire. Instead, she redefined the moment on her own terms. She showed that grace under pressure was not weakness but power, the kind of power that levels arrogance without ever shouting. As the chamber slowly regained its breath, the tension broke into murmurs, half-stunned, half-celebratory. Reporters darted quick glances at one another, silently agreeing they had just witnessed something worth headlines. Crockett's name would not fade into the transcript. It had been etched into the stage in that instant. From the outside for those who had tuned in for entertainment or indignation, the moment hit differently. Social media feeds began to pulse, hashtags ready to ignite. Clips of the 7 interruptions and the mic drop line were already being clipped, cued, shared. Because Crockett hadn't just spoken for herself, she had provided the line every silenced person ever longed to deliver. Viewers didn't just admire her, they lived vicariously through her. They saw her stare down arrogance and win, not through anger, but through mastery. For Miller, it was an unraveling. For Crockett, it was a coronation. For America, it was a reckoning. The chamber exhaled. Crockett's lips pressed into a calm line, her shoulders still squared, radiating the dignity she had carried through all 6 interruptions and now her quiet victory. And just like that, the storm had broken, not with thunder, but with lightning. One line. Measured, sharp, devastating. The truth had landed. But the drama didn't end at the debate stage. It detonated far beyond. The moment the words left her lips, it started. First came the hush of impact in the chamber, then the slow. A rumble of recognition as onlookers realized they had just witnessed a turning point. But outside those four walls, across laptops, phones, and television screens, the shockwaves spread instantly. Within seconds, clips of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop line began ricocheting across social media TikToks. Instagram Reels, Twitter feeds alive with the electricity of vindication. The hashtags were born almost instantly. Hashtag she shut him down. Hashtag seventh line. Hashtag Truthlands. Each one igniting, tumbling through timelines, carried like a banner by people who had never even heard of this hearing until that moment. One TikTok looped the interruptions in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Before freezing on Crockett's.com face. The beat dropping perfectly as she delivered, "Every time you cut me off, you don't reveal my weaknesses. Reveal yours." The sound was reused tens of thousands of times in hours, turned into memes about work meetings, classrooms, even family arguments at Thanksgiving. Twitter threads spiraled with applause. One writer typed, "This is what dignity under fire looks like." Another tweeted, "Crockett just handed a masterclass to everyone who's ever been silenced." The reactions weren't just political, they were personal. People invoked their own experiences of being interrupted. The teenager cut off by a teacher, the young professional overlooked in boardrooms, the immigrant parent whose accent was mocked before their idea could be understood. Crockett's words weren't hers alone anymore. They had become a vessel for millions. Supporters erupted in admiration. Row after row of replies spoke less about Miller and more about what her composure represented. "I didn't even know who." She was one viral post read, "But after tonight, I'll never forget." Others celebrated her refusal to get dragged into Miller's combat style. They recognized her silence not as weakness, but as strategy. Threads carried photos of her mid-moment with captions like, "Grace is the loudest voice. This is how you fight arrogance without lowering yourself." Meanwhile, Miller's defenders scrambled. Some tried spinning the interruptions as necessary passion. Others posted clipped rewrites attempting to paint Crockett's line as performative. But it was too late. Each defense only amplified the initial sting. Each denial drowned out by tens of thousands, retweeting the original exchange untouched. His tactic, dominate the space with interruption, had failed spectacularly. No spin could salvage the perception that he had overplayed his hand and been exposed. Public opinion had tilted sharply, irreversibly, toward the woman who turned. 6 insults into her one moment of thunder, celebrities chimed in, adding another layer of validation. A prominent actor tweeted simply, "Standing ovation," adding a fire emoji next to Crockett's name. A best-selling author clipped the video and wrote, "This right here, dignity beating arrogance. This is why people fight to be heard." Commentators on late-night shows wove it into their monologues, both poking fun at Miller's sputtering interruptions and celebrating Crockett's surgical strike. 7 tries, one host quipped, and all it did was give her the perfect setup for a historic takedown. Journalists who had sat in stunned silence during the hearing now filled columns with analysis. Op-eds praised Crockett, not just for what she said, but for how she said it. Passion journalists could understand. They saw it daily. But composure. Silence weaponized into strength. That was rare. That was memorable. Political strategists nodded, knowingly, admitting that the clip wasn't just a victory in a room. It had become a cultural moment. And in communities, perhaps most importantly, the impact ran deeper. Watch parties, college dorms, family living rooms. Church groups all replayed the video, sharing the line like a story passed by word of mouth. For them, it was less about politics and more about validation. They saw in Jasmine Crockett's pause and delivery the reflection of their own long-endured frustrations. She hadn't simply defended herself, she had defended them. Everyday Americans who were tired of arrogance deciding the volume and dignity. Being treated like silence, the memes carried both humor and weight. One cartoon showed Miller's mouth as a megaphone spewing nonsense, only to be shattered by Crockett's single line illustrated as a lightning bolt. Another viral moment saw Gen Z remixing the exchange into a music beat, her calm words dropping right after a bass line, the lyric emblazoned, "Truth doesn't shout, it lands." It didn't matter if viewers were political junkies or casual. Scrollers, the scene had crystallized into culture, and Miller. His frustration metastasized online, replayed endlessly in frozen screenshots of his grimace. His jaw tight, watching his authority unravel. What he had assumed to be dominance was cast forever as desperation. The arrogance that once seemed unshakable had been captured in a moment of smallness, forever attached to Crockett's thunderous calm. The interpretation was clear, and its resonance deep. This wasn't only about politics anymore. It was about people. It was about dignity piercing through arrogance, silence transformed into steel. It was about telling anyone who doubted their worth, their composure could shake the ground beneath a bully's feet. The words weren't just remembered. They became a chant, a symbol, a call shared again and again across digital plazas that never closed. This wasn't just a moment. It became a message. In politics, victories are often measured in votes tallied, bills passed, or applause lines captured. But there are other victories too quieter. It's more enduring, the kind that seep into the cultural memory because they validate something deeper than policy. Jasmine Crockett's seventh line wasn't just a clever retort to a noisy antagonist. It was a declaration that dignity, no matter how many times it's spoken over, can still rise above arrogance. The interruptions were meant to drown her out. That was the tactic. Overwhelm, dominate, smother. And for a while it may have seemed to work. 6 times her words were hijacked. 6 times the current of conversation bent in the direction of arrogance. But interruption is a temporary weapon. Creates noise, not resonance. Crockett reminded the country that noise fades quickly, truth endures. The sound of Miller's interruptions bled into each other until they were indistinguishable, forgettable. Her line, by contrast, etched itself permanently into the narrative because it embodied the clarity people yearned for in a world too full of static. The moral is both simple and profound. Bluster may capture attention in the moment, but it cannot command respect in the long term. A loud voice can fill a room, but it cannot fill a heart. Persistence, empathy, justice, the qualities embodied by Crockett in that instant, carry a different kind of weight. The kind that doesn't just win a hearing, but inspires movements. Dignity might appear soft to those addicted to arrogance, but in truth, it is steel wrapped in grace. And grace, when unleashed with precision, is unstoppable. What Crockett modeled was not only a personal triumph, it was a universal lesson. Everyone who has been dismissed, waved off, told they were too emotional or too quiet, suddenly saw their restraint reimagined as power. Everyone who has been told their tone made them unfit, their identity and inconvenience, could look at this moment and say, it is not weakness to hold back, it is mastery. Resilience is not an absence of fire, the discipline to choose when to ignite it. This is the essence of Americanness when it is at its best, the idea that democracy doesn't belong to those who speak longest or loudest, but to those who speak with truth. America's story has never been written only by those who shout, but by those who endure, those who rise from silence and make their words matter.
8.
Crockett's composure became more than a personal trait. It became a reminder that America's strength comes not from intimidation, but from inclusion, dignity, and the courage to face arrogance head-on without surrendering one's humanity. The emotional lesson lingers for the audience. Your silence, your patience, your persistence is not weakness. It may be the very soil in which your strength grows. And when the moment comes, when the world finally leans in, you, like Crockett, can deliver your truth with such sharpness that no dismissal, no interruption, no arrogance can erase it. That is why the clip reverberated far beyond politics. It was no longer just her victory. It was a message to countless others. You are not invisible, and your calm is not vulnerability. One sentence spoken with dignity can silence a storm. Even those far removed from D.C. felt the resonance. In classrooms, students remembered to hold their ground instead of shrinking. In boardrooms, employees recalled Crockett's composure and steadied themselves against dismissive colleagues. Around family tables, people who were used to being ignored realized that when their moment comes, they can speak with dignity and reshape the room. Crockett's triumph wasn't rooted in partisanship. It was rooted in universal truth. Arrogance eventually implodes. The truth always breathes. And here lies the true power of her mic drop moment. It expanded beyond the news cycle into a moral cycle. It whispered to the silenced, "Hold steady." It shouted to the arrogant, "This is your mirror." Taught the country that dignity is not soft. It is sharp, devastating, and unforgettable. Because what matters in the end isn't who shouted loudest, but who spoke the truth. 6 times interrupted. On the 7th, silenced by her courage. That is the headline that will echo from this chamber. Long after the clip stops playing, long after hashtags fade and memes cycle out of favor. Because what unfolded here was more than a clash of 2 voices. It was a universal reminder that arrogance can be loud, but dignity can be louder still when it speaks with truth. Stephen Miller thought his interruptions were weapons. He mistook Volume 4, Strength, Control for victory. But tonight showed otherwise. His arrogance became its own undoing. Every attempt to drown out Jasmine Crockett only sharpened the contrast between noise and clarity, between venom and composure. And when her line landed, calm and devastating, the world understood what true power looks like. A woman who refuses to be diminished. The moral reverberates. Dignity is greater than arrogance. Truth is greater than noise. That is why millions celebrated, why the clip will be replayed in classrooms, on timelines, and in hearts. Arrogance always tries to write the story, but it is dignity that history remembers, and that is the purpose of Empire Naked: to cut through the noise, to strip arrogance of its theater, and to reveal the raw power of truth, composure, and justice. If you felt that rush of recognition, if you saw yourself in JasmineCrockett's.com, if you've ever been interrupted and longed to answer back with dignity, this is your home for stories that remind you of your own strength. Subscribe to Empire Naked, where the interruptions end and the truth speaks. Share this moment, carry it forward, and take your place among those who refuse to be silenced. The next story is coming. You won't want to miss it.